So, Darryl Sloan, welcome to the show, man. Thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, no problem. You reached out to me really just a few days ago, I think, and said you had a book called I Universe, which, of course, that is an intriguing title. And as I read through it, it's a rather personal journey through your own, I guess, frustrations with, as you called it in the book, trying to figure out what life is all about. You also said that it is a love letter to the person I used to be, someone whose anxieties and sorrows are undoubtedly mirrored in the experience of others. And to be honest, I couldn't agree more. Like, I think we all have those anxieties and sorrows on some level. But do tell us a little bit more about, why you called this a love letter to the person you used to be.
Well, I have a big history with Christianity. I became an evangelical Christian when I was age 17, and that lasted until I was 35. But it was a rocky road full of confusion and unsatisfaction, and I could never really make it work. And in between times, I tried the typical atheist approach to life, and that didn't really work either. And it was only when I was about 35 that I had a big paradigm shift, a big change in perspective about what was really going on with life. And since then, I've never looked back. Some people call a thing like this a spiritual awakening, but I don't really like that sort of term. It sounds as if something supernatural happened to you, and it really wasn't like that at all. It was just I started to finally get clarity. And so the love letter to the person I used to be, it's like looking back on those 2 decades of confusion. I'm sort of telling my past self all the things that I wish I could have known 20 years earlier. And essentially the paradigm shift was, it goes by the name non-duality in the modern day. But it's not new by any means. It's the same sort of underlying philosophy that you'd find in the likes of Zen Buddhism or in Advaita in the Hindu tradition. And the writer Aldous Huxley referred to this as the perennial philosophy, that you find it all over the place in the ancient world. And it's the one sort of spiritual, if I can use that word, approach to life that's actually still compatible with science. And I think that's where Christianity has a big downfall. You either have to put the word of God up against science and one falls. Which one do you pick? So that's kind of where I'm coming from.
Well, you said something there that I have also said in private conversations, and I'm sure I've said it on the podcast here too, but you said that, for lack of a better term, like, people refer to this as a spiritual awakening. And I've always said, no, that's not what it is to me. Like, it doesn't feel very spiritual I guess, in its essence. But it is like some sort of awakening on some level, like maybe just to your own bullshit, if I could, just be so frank about that. It just seems like there was something about it that it woke me up to more aspects of myself, which in turn, I guess, changed the way that I perceive the world around me, and then ultimately, changed the way that I perceived myself. And would you consider it something similar? And what term could we use if it's not a spiritual, sort of awakening? Because that does seem like it's more of a social media online buzzword.
I think I like paradigm shift. It really wasn't, it wasn't a sudden thing. I can point basically to summer 2008 as the turning point of my life, but I can't pinpoint a moment. And for some people, I think they get into this through meditation, and they meditate maybe for a long time, and finally something clicks and they've got it. That wasn't my approach. Mine was more intellectual. I was reading about this sort of stuff, and it resonated with me. And it was just that I'd never encountered it before. I think if I had encountered it 5 or 10 years before, it would have resonated with me back then too. But I read mostly Christian literature, unfortunately. So yeah. And I think some people who are on this kind of path, I think they downplay the importance of the intellectual side of things. Like, it's not the authentic experience, but it really is. It runs deep. And in the past decade or so that I've been going down this road, I've really never looked back. And it has cost me a few relationships. on the Christian side of things, because some people are just not happy that, for one, that I'm not agreeing with them about what's behind life. The old story about Jesus dying on the cross to save you from your sins. But I'm also willing to very aggressively criticize the Christian belief system, and they really don't like that at all, some of them. But I feel a sense of, it's not done in anger, really. I feel a sense of responsibility, because unlike someone like, Richard Dawkins, who wrote The God Delusion, yeah, he can offer something there, but he can't offer, he doesn't really know what it's like to spend 2 decades of your life as a Christian. So I've got that insider mentality. I know how they think because I was one. And so the sort of critique of Christianity that I portray in the book is rather deeper than what you would find in a book written by a typical atheist. Yeah.
So do you find nothing redeeming about the Christian worldview then?
No, I do find certain things redeeming. I mean, if you're a Christian, you're interested in ethics, you're interested in being good, living as a good citizen and everything. But ultimately, the metaphysics behind Christianity is outdated, and some things about it really do more harm than good. Christianity is essentially against the flesh, against the animal side of human nature. It's the flesh versus the spirit. One of the most important journeys I went on since then has been to integrate the animal side of human nature. The one interesting voice in that regard that I discovered and found very interesting, and I suppose it's kind of controversial to some, it would be Anton LaVey. Are you familiar with who that is?
Yeah. I mean, I have a copy of the Satanic Bible in my study here somewhere.
I have all of his books on my shelf. So I encountered, I read a little bit of Anton LaVey, and for 2 reasons, really. One was I wanted to discover whether there was any truth to this whole idea that there was a satanic conspiracy behind government and whatnot. And I also wanted to get a handle on whether there was any kind of reality behind magic, because I had been witness to something of a psychic nature in my early teens, and I'd now become very interested in parapsychology. So I was interested to see whether magic and parapsychology were essentially the same thing under the surface. So that led me to read the Satanic Bible, and I ended up discovering something through that I really didn't expect. I ended up agreeing with maybe 70 or 80% of what I was reading. And I suppose I should clarify for anyone listening that we're talking about a symbolic use of the character Satan. We're not talking about the literal belief in the character Satan as something real. Anton LaVey's Satanism was a kind of masterstroke of marketing in that he used the bad guy of the Bible to base a personal philosophy on, in the symbolic sense. So that ensured his popularity for decades to come. Mm-hmm. So Anton LaVey was the one guy who, he kind of made a religion based upon the flesh rather than a religion that was against the flesh. And I find this fascinating because the whole idea of us born in sin no longer worked for me. And I realized that I was an animal. Even though there's something very special about consciousness, I was an animal. And I noticed even in some of the spirituality that was in my camp, the non-duality camp, some of it's still very, what's the way to say this? Very white light, very all about, purity and these kinds of things. Some teachers will even wear white clothing, which is symbolic of purity. And I was starting to come around to the idea that we have to let all this go. We have to get fully away from the religious trappings and embrace, the animal self. Whereas some non-duality teachers talk about how this is all about love. And I realized I was kind of going down a different route with all of this. I was, to state it very, I'm kind of going off on a tangent here, but just to state this very sort of in an ordinary fashion, when a lion tears apart a gazelle, that's perfectly natural. It's perfectly allowed. It's how life works. It is, in a sense, non-duality in operation. But you'll get non-duality teachers who talk about love, like love is what it's all about. And no, it has to be about everything in life. And this whole division that we have with material on one side and spirit in the other, that has to go because it's artificial. I think it was Albert Camus had a really great quote in his book, The Rebel, where he said, "Man is the only creature who refuses to be what he is." So it was just such a breath of fresh air after all of the mental gymnastics that you had to put yourself through in Christianity in terms of ethics, just to realize, there's actually nothing wrong with the human organism just as it is. And understanding yourself more in terms of, your evolutionary biology rather than this idea that you're this broken thing that needs to be saved from sin. And getting back to the original point about spiritual awakening, I think, the term spiritual awakening, the term, enlightenment, liberation, it's in the same kind of ballpark as the way a Christian uses the word salvation. And that's part of why I don't like it, because you're not broken. And it's terrible sales pitch to have for somebody who's got a book out, because I'm basically saying you don't actually need me. There's nothing broken about you, but what you maybe do need is somebody to tell you you're not broken,
Yeah, you actually used the phrase in the book, the Enlightenment hoax. Tell people what you meant by that.
Oh, just exactly what I was talking about, that you get these spiritual teachers who basically say, I'm the guy with the big answer you've been looking for. And they tend to project an image of themselves of saintly, otherworldly sort of perfection. And it's all a con. It's designed to make you think you too can be like me. And I don't like people who project themselves like this. I don't know whether I should say any names, but I would think of Eckhart Tolle in those kinds of terms, even though some of what he says I quite like. Some of what he says I don't like either, but he's hugely popular. And you got to kind of ask why somebody is hugely popular like that, because I think a genuine spirituality tends to be more esoteric. It tends to be for the few who really go looking for it, not for the masses, because it's hard work to actually get to grips with what life's all about. So if you're a teacher who's telling people what they want to hear, telling people you can be free from suffering, you can go through life unmoved by anything, well, people love that, but it's not true. And it's not true because you're not in control of everything, just like a gazelle isn't in control of the lion that's eating him. So that's what I think of as the hoax behind it all. You're not broken. The way I kind of approach, although I'm kind of teaching a message that you could say it's a spiritual message, but the analogy I would use is kind of like this. You can imagine yourself stranded on a desert island. So you can be a person who knows how to make fire or a person who doesn't know how to make fire. So the person who knows how to make fire is going to be better off than the person who doesn't. So all I'm offering really to anybody is an enrichment to consciousness. It's not an awakening. You're still going to have hard things to face in life, but maybe it doesn't have to be just quite so hard as it would be if you didn't do some hard work and soul searching and get to grips with a genuine form of spirituality. So it's not awakening. It's just things can be a little better than they used to be.
Yeah, and I'm actually kind of glad you name dropped Eckhart Tolle, because I felt that way about him for a few years now. Like he's so popular, and I think a lot of what he says is marketing and PR. You know, I kind of look at him as like a non-Christian version of like Joel Osteen. You know, the famous sort of like pastor at this mega church down in Texas here. That just, you know, he's so popular that you gotta like really scrutinize what he says then. And I granted, I know like a guy like Joel is just preaching from the Bible, but I think he put Eckhart in there as well. And there's some other people who I would question too, that if I name drop them, there might be some audience members here like, well, wait, what the hell? You know, like I would put Alan Watts in that kind of a group. You know,
I actually love Alan Watts.
well, that's the thing too. Like I see these quotes that circulate around, and I'm like, oh yeah, that's very, you know, sort of self-empowering. But then I realize, like, well, like he's in that same vein. Like he's probably not as popular as a guy like Eckhart is, but he's still like, I guess when you get into these sort of alternative spiritual movements or occult movements or whatever you want to call them, that there's these guys that are propped up like Tim Leary, you know, or Terrence McKenna, that I just have some issue with them on some level. Maybe their connections with, you know, government intelligence and things like that. But yeah, so not to get too far down that path, because that's not what this is about. I tend to make things about conspiracy.
You had Brad Warner on your show a few weeks ago, or was it a couple of months ago? But I really like him purely because he's just this really ordinary guy who's into Godzilla movies and stuff like that. Can you imagine Eckhart Tolle saying, "I watch Godzilla movies"?
No, but no, that's why. Yeah, that was kind of my point. Like, I feel like he's just propped up as this sort of face of alternative spirituality. Yeah. But I just think that it's mostly marketing and PR, just to sell books. And hey, you know what? Teach their own. If that's what you want to do, that's fine. But I think a lot of people fall into that trap of that hoax that you were describing there. And you know, so the subtitle of this book is Demolishing and Rebuilding Spirituality for a Scientific Age. And I guess we've touched on that maybe a little bit here already, but explain to the audience what you mean by that exactly. What are you trying to demolish and then rebuild?
Well, I'm basically saying that you can't trust the religion or spirituality that you were born into purely by the accident of whatever geographical location you happen to be born in. For me, that was Protestant Christianity in Northern Ireland. Could have been Catholic if I was born on the other side of town. If I'd been born in Utah, it would have been Mormonism. If I'd been born in Iraq or some such country, it would have been Islam. And if you look at the statistics, people tend to just stay with the religion that they were born into. So it's, you know, they can't all be true. So the only way is to demolish, or if you like, deconstruct everything that you were conditioned to believe as a child. And that's one of the most nefarious things about religion, is that they really want to get it into you as a child at an age where you're like this sponge that is just soaking up all the information that's around you without any sort of critical thinking. So as an adult, you have to go back and you have to take a sledgehammer to all of it and see whether it actually will hold up to that sort of an attack. And then when you're left with nothing, you start to build again. Did my audio drop there for a second? Sorry.
No.
Hello?
You're good. Go ahead.
Okay. So then you just start to build again, and you just make sure this time that you're using the right sort of tools. You learn about logical fallacies. You learn how to think properly. It's a lot more important to learn how to think than it is to be told what to think. And so that's how I sort of articulated my path. And in part 2 of the book, which is called Deep Dive, I go into the nature of reality. We talk about, you know, can we still use the word God intelligently? What is consciousness? What's the nature of reality around you? What's physicality? What is time? Where is it all going? The big questions. And there are answers of a sort to be had.
Yeah, and I do want to do a deep dive here, but before we do, I have a couple more questions about, you know, I guess, so you said that you started to look into Anton LaVey's message. You started to look more into magic. You also mentioned, I guess, maybe a sort of psychic experience you had when you were younger. Take us through that sort of research that you were doing, or the things that you were exposing yourself to, these philosophies and whatnot. Like, at what point did you start to take them, I guess, a bit more seriously, and then I guess maybe construct your worldview around them?
Well, originally it was the first author that I was reading about this sort of stuff was David Icke. He's not an author that I pay much attention to now, but at the time it was a good voice to listen to. It was in particular his book, I Am Me, I Am Free. Now, I don't buy into the conspiracy theory stuff. I don't buy into all the strange claims about reptilians, but he had a metaphysics that was in keeping to an extent with this thing that we call non-duality. So he would use the term infinite consciousness. He would say, we're all infinite consciousness. And I was trying to get to grips with what this all meant. And the idea that behind the surface of reality as we see it, everything is one, or as he would say, everything is one consciousness. We're not all separate beings. We're all one under the surface. This resonated with me in some fashion that I couldn't articulate it in an intellectual way originally, but I can now, but I couldn't at the time. But I was baffled by how sure I was that that was true. So I just kept going along that sort of path. And I remember kind of thinking that when we love one another, the thing that this is the philosophy that makes sense of that under the surface, it's one person loving another person, but really loving themselves, because there is no separation if we could just get under the surface of things. So as time went by, I started putting a bit more of an intellectual spin on things, because everywhere I looked, every avenue I looked into, it all supported this. Even if you look at something like quantum theory, it supports the idea that the three-dimensional world of objects is a kind of surface veneer over a more fundamental reality, which is essentially a field, as they would say. And they would talk about the unified field. So the world of Newton, the world of the billiard ball universe of atoms and molecules, that's not fundamental. There's something behind that. And what is that? That's the big question. But I also realized at the same time that this sort of philosophy supported the view that psychic phenomena are possible. Maybe not real, but certainly possible. So I had cast my mind back to this experience I had when I was about 13, when I had a friend at school who claimed to be able to move objects with his mind. He claimed he could do telekinesis. And I was a naive 13-year-old at the time, and I actually believed him even before I'd seen it. But the way he presented it, he wasn't trying to make a big show of things. He just talked about the fact that he could do this occasionally, and it wasn't something he was using to show off to people. But anyway, we were at his friend's house one evening, and it was late, and his friend had gone out, and it was just me and him in the house. And I bugged him until he would show me this thing actually happening. And he didn't want to originally, but he did. And he just sat down at a coffee table. He put 4 matches in a square, and he rested his elbows on the table, and he put his fingers on his temples. And one by one, he made the matches move. And I was absolutely gobsmacked. And then his friend came in about 20 minutes later, and I forced him to do the same thing again to show his friend. And again, it was done absolutely faultless. And then his friend's sister arrived, and I told him to do it again, and he did it again. So obviously it could have been a fake. It could have been, he could have been just messing around, and it could have been little more than a magic trick. But being naive, I believed him anyway. And later on, I did try to do the same thing myself in a fake fashion, just to see if I could fake it. And I couldn't. I could make the matches move by blowing on them, but you had to blow really hard, and you could definitely, I would have heard him blowing if he was blowing. So I had no explanation for this, but I always carried the memory of it through life. And then when I was 35, coming to terms with this new philosophy, I thought to myself, what about that experience? What about that? And he'd moved to Australia a long, long time before, but I happened to get back in touch with him and I asked him, so bear in mind, over 2 decades have gone by. And I asked him, way back then when you were doing that, was that real or was it fake? And he still maintained that it was absolutely real. Although he did tell me a few other things that were a little bit scary, that he'd gotten very deep into the occult, and he'd had a church intervention that to sort of rescue him. And he said that the garden outside the house caught fire. Now, I didn't know what to make of that, because I had just come out of Christianity, and he's telling me that people were praying and flames were erupting outside the house. I really don't know what to make of that, except it sort of strikes me as convenient that the fire erupted in the garden and not in the living room. It might have been some snake oil, if you know what I mean. But anyway, I was determined to get to the bottom of it. So I did my own experiments into telekinesis. I did not know how to do it. I didn't know what literature to trust. So I just persevered and persevered until finally I got something to happen. And I've only ever been able to make a psi wheel spin. And I've got it to spin under a glass bowl occasionally. And I was very skeptical of my own achievements in this as well. But there are physiological sensations that occur when this happens. And I've come to the conclusion personally that there is a reality to it. And I uploaded a load of videos to YouTube about this, that are some of which are very well known now and a lot of views on them. There is a technique that you can use to essentially get something strange like this happening, and it involves non-thinking. It's very odd. Kind of pull the mind back, and I guess you could call it a meditative state or a light trance or something, but you've got to get into this state of, somebody called it focused inattention, and that's a weird term, but it sort of fits, and it's in that state that you kind of it's hard to explain, because to be honest, I don't fully understand why it occurs, but it does occur. And I guess anybody can really try it. And I don't expect people to believe me. What I hope they will do is try it for themselves, but it takes more than one go to get it going. But you certainly can do this and have your mind blown the way mine was blown.
Yeah, I've never seen anything like that in person. I'd like to, because I come at that stuff from a more skeptical lens, or with a more skeptical lens these days. But
that's fully understandable.
Yeah. But I'm curious. Well, and the thing is that I don't know why, because I've had some interesting, sort of parapsychological experiences of my own that's happened to me. Not anything like moving matches or objects like that with my mind, but I think there is something about it that as I get older and as I guess I scrutinize myself, much like you said, like you have to take a sledgehammer to what you believe in. And I've never really had any sort of grounded spiritual beliefs. You know what I mean? I was not raised in a religious household. I had nothing sort of thrown at me in my youth to form that side of my worldview. But as I got older, and then I got that to that point that we were talking about at the beginning of the chat, about that awakening point, which I don't describe it as very spiritual. I just describe it as, I guess a paradigm shift would be a good way to describe it. But I'm now, I guess, more questioning the occult and these sort of, alternative spiritualities with that same sort of scrutiny that I've always questioned, like the Abrahamic traditions with. So I am curious, like how you look at a belief system like the occult magic, or astrology, or things like that, divination, and then how you see them, I guess, pairing with psychic phenomena, which you described earlier, and then if you also, I guess, have taken the sledgehammer to that side of the debate as well.
Okay. Well, to start with, I was fascinated by the question of whether psychic phenomena and magic were essentially the same thing, and I do think they are. But arriving at that conclusion, I had to sort of look at a few things. So one of the first things that I came across was, well, first of all, let me put this in context. On one occasion, when I was trying to move the side wheel underneath the glass bowl, I was trying to do it without the use of my hands. Now, one time when I did use my hands, I had a physiological sensation of something shooting up my arm and out of my hand, almost like a tingling, kind of like the sort of thing that happens, if you get a little bit of static shock or something. Not painful, but just something moved. But then there was one time I tried it without using my hands. I wanted to see if I could move the side wheel just sitting there in front of the coffee table with the side wheel on it, glass bowl on top. And I tried it numerous times, couldn't get it to work until this one time that I did get it to work. And right at the moment of it happening, there was this strange turbulence in my abdomen. Now, I didn't do anything to have that physiological sensation. It's just something that occurred, and then the side wheel moved. So it's kind of like, the way if you're typing on a keyboard, you don't have to think about what your fingers are doing. They just do the work as long as there's already subconscious programming there that your fingers know what to do. So my body was kind of just doing its own thing. Now, where this became interesting for me was later on, I was reading a book. I think it might have been Liber Null and Psychonaut by Peter J. Carroll. That's Chaos Magic. And, or was it that one? Hang on a second. Yeah, it might have been the book by Sean Connolly, which is called The Scion's Handbook. Anyway, there was a diagram in there that showed someone, and it showed a kind of energy center in the center of a person's chest flowing outwards down the arms and then out from there. And the fact that it began right there I said the center of the chest, really the abdomen. The fact that it began there, it's kind of like I looked at that and realized, now I know this guy isn't just trying to hoodwink people, because he's had the same darn experience that I had. So that's it allowed me to gauge that there was something real to what this guy was writing about. And I don't know what kind of framework to put on it, except maybe the Asian schools of thought. I don't know whether this is Taoism or what, but have you heard of Qi?
Yeah. I guess you would spell it CHI or QI in some.
Yeah, and they have this area of the body called the Dantian, or the lower Dantian. I mean, we could put that kind of a framework on it. It's as good as any. This idea that there are these subtle energies flowing around the body, and they can be controlled and directed. So that's one framework that makes sense to me. The other one is Peter J. Carroll would talk about inhibitory and excitatory states of consciousness being the kind of gateway that allows for a magical effect to occur. And I suppose you could call the state of consciousness that I was in inhibitory. What he means by an excitatory state of consciousness is something extreme, like stimulating yourself into some kind of berserker rage or sexual arousal or something to that effect. Now, the key factor in both these states of consciousness is that the rationalizing thinking mind is turned off. And I noticed the same thing when I was reading about the ritual chamber in Anton LaVey's works. It's all about giving your emotions something to do and not thinking about it. He describes it as an intellectual decompression chamber. And it all seemed to be pointing in the same direction for me. The idea that if you can just get your mind, that thinking part of the mind, to switch itself off unusual things can occur. It may well be possible, I have no experience of this, it may well be possible that things like blessings and curses work in this exact fashion. And I even wonder sometimes, because I've attended some Pentecostal churches in my time, the kind of church service that happens there, it's very over the top with the use of stimulating music and people with their arms in the air shouting. And the whole thing really resembles a ritual chamber, an occult ritual chamber, although they would never call it such a thing. But the connection is there. It's all about getting yourself into a hyper-intensive state of emotion in outpourings of prayer to God. Or if you like, you could simply characterize it outpourings of the will, which is what magic is. Just the outpouring of the will out into the cosmos, if you like, with the view that certain states of consciousness allow for strange things to happen. So oddly enough, I came back around to this idea that prayer might actually work, even though I didn't believe in God in the monotheistic sense anymore. It seemed to resemble magic, and magic seemed to resemble psychic abilities, and the whole thing was just, everything was the same thing, just with sort of different dressing on top. You know, the people in the occult, they love the theatrical side of magic, you know, dressing up in black robes and things, lighting candles. But the magic isn't in the world. You know, the magic is in you, because it's to do with a focused outpouring of the will. And all these things that we do, all these quasi-religious trappings that we put on things, they're all just there to aid your state of consciousness in one direction or another. A lot of that's highly theoretical. My own experience really is just in the psychic dabbling, but I did find studying magic to be very fascinating. And for me, it was never about trying to find power. It was always just about looking for a kind of experiential confirmation that the philosophy that I had chosen, this thing called non-duality, that it was actually true. Because in terms of the way the typical atheist thinks, psychic phenomena really are absurd, because they don't fit that materialist paradigm. But they do fit a paradigm where consciousness is viewed as every bit as important as matter. I sort of see it as the whole universe is a kind of field of consciousness in potential. That's kind of the way I look at it. Dean Radin, who wrote some really excellent books on parapsychology, he uses the term field consciousness. And a human being is not a soul the way that you would be portrayed in religion. We don't have a mind as such. We're all just these little focus points of consciousness. We're just these little areas where the universe has focused itself into a state of limitation where it can peer out through a pair of eyes and have an experience of something less than its completeness. Okay, I'm being very abstract here, but that's kind of what the title of the book is all about, I Universe. It sounds on the surface like the biggest statement of ego that you could possibly say, I am the universe, but it's actually the complete opposite. It's saying that there is no I inside the head. The only true I is the whole thing. But the whole thing focuses itself into an experience of mind through bodies, if you like. Any of that make any sense?
Yeah, I'm wondering, like, and I've been thinking about this for several minutes as you've been talking, so, and it's something that I was thinking about earlier too, but you have this idea of duality and non-duality, and I'm pretty sure you're coming at this now from a more dualistic worldview. Is that correct?
Yeah, but the trick is that the two are not separate.
Okay.
When I started getting into non-duality, I sort of thought, okay, I'm stuck here in the duality. I've got to get out of that. I got to find the non-duality. It's not like that. The whole universe is non-dualistic. There isn't two. There's just one. The sort of duality, I mean, we could apply this to everything. We could apply it to Cartesian duality. That's the mind-body duality. There's no duality there. If you try to find the soul or the mind as an object sitting inside the head, you won't find it. It's just not there. So self, other, spirit, matter, those dualities don't actually exist. It's all one. You can extend it even further to the duality that people believe in from creator and creation. If we look at the law of conservation of energy, which states that energy cannot be created or destroyed, it has this quality of permanence, of eternal permanence, which is the quality that religious people typically attribute to God. So it's essentially saying that if you're looking for God, look no further than energy. It's permanent. And so there's no duality between creator and creation. The Big Bang wasn't a moment of creation. It was just the changing of a singularity into space-time. So the duality is a kind of, you can perceive, if you just lift two objects in your hands, two separate objects, you can look at them and you can go, okay, I've got two things here. This is duality. But it's not really. If you get down to a fundamental level of being, a quantum physicist would talk about getting right down to the Planck scale or whatever, you'd find that those objects don't exist. They just appear that way to the senses. It's actually all one big fuzzy field of quantum entangled strangeness, So you don't have to get to the non-duality. You're already looking at it. It just manifests itself as apparent duality.
Well, you mentioned space-time, and I wanted to ask you about that too. What do you think of outer space? Do you think that there's I think you referred to something in a book like the perception deception. I'm curious if you could take us through what your thoughts are on space these days.
Yeah, it's funny. I called one of my chapters the perception deception. And then David Icke released a book called The Perception Deception, but I got there first. But anyway, yeah. Well, by space, are we talking about outer space, or are we talking just about matter?
I think we could talk about matter first, and then maybe outer space. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. Well, if you look out through you look out through your eyes and you think that what you see is how things really are, and it just isn't. And a simple, we can look at that very simply we know that bees, for instance, can see ultraviolet light. We can't. So when a bee looks at a flower and a human looks at a flower, who sees what the flower actually looks like? Neither of us, because we're stuck behind perceptions. So we never really get to see what physical reality actually resembles. We've never even seen light, because as soon as light hits the retina, that's where it stops, and it's translated into data that the brain perceives way at the back in the visual cortex in the darkness of your skull. So we think about light, but we've never seen light. So this is just the predicament that we're all in, but we have this misplaced trust that when we tap a solid object, that it's really there and it's really solid, and that's the fundamental reality because you feel it as solid. But that's just the rules of the game. There are things that will pass through that object, such as X-rays, and they will simply not care that it's solid. So the universe isn't the way it isn't the way we think it is. It's just the way we're just a human thinking of it in a certain way. We're putting an interpretation on things, and that's fine. The whole game is designed to work this way. But I think it's good to come to terms with the fact that you are essentially living in what could be described as a big hologram, because that's when we start to understand that it may be possible for the things of a psychic nature to occur. Like we have the natural intuition that a mind exists inside the skull. But like I said before, you go looking for it, you can't find it. So where does a mind exist? And that's actually, we don't realize it, but that's the wrong question. It's kind of like saying, is the number 5 married or single? It's a question that doesn't make sense. Mind doesn't actually exist anywhere spatially. It's the big mystery that there appears to be consciousness peering out into a physical arena, but there's something a little bit like the Matrix going on, So that's kind of my view of space. We're not here to try and break out of it somehow into a more fundamental reality, but it isn't fundamentally real in the way that we naturally think of it.
Have you ever thought about, and I'm referencing your analogy a minute ago about light entering a retina. Have you ever thought about our eyes as black holes? Because once that light gets in there, it's sort of immediately swallowed up, like you would describe a black hole, how it just sort of eats everything up as soon as it goes into it. And I thought that light maybe entering your eye like that would mimic maybe the behavior of a black hole.
Yeah, I don't know. I haven't really thought about it in those terms. There are other creatures, of course, that they build their picture of reality through something other than their eyes, like the likes of the bat. It has this form of echolocation using sound, its big ears. So it definitely has a picture of reality in its little bat brain, but it doesn't have the same kind of one that we would have because it has very poor eyesight and relies much more on hearing. So it's all kinds of strange and wonderful ways of perceiving the universe, and the eyes just being one of those. Yeah.
Yeah, I think I'd like to be a Batman at some point in my life. But back to the back to outer space, and I guess we're talking about physical, our physical, material reality here. What do you think of outer space? Because I had a conversation with some patrons on Patreon probably about a month ago, and there was probably 5-7 of us in there, and we all sort of agreed that space wasn't real, or at least not as we are, sort of told about it. So where do you come from on that these days?
Space wasn't real. That's very strange. I would be okay with the traditional view of that we came out of the Big Bang singularity about 13.7 billion years ago. Universe has been expanding. But yeah, I mean, at a fundamental level of being, this big expanding universe is something other than a great big sort of billiard ball universe. That was the universe according to Newton. But we know that we're looking for a quantum theory of gravity, for instance, and we haven't got one yet, but we know that we need one because we've got quantum theories for everything else, pretty much. And then there's this thing called dark matter or dark energy that seems to fill everything in space, and we haven't yet got to the bottom of that. So there's big mysteries out there regarding space. I really don't know what to make of it, but it's fascinating.
It is pretty fascinating, yeah. I mean, it's not something I'd like to spend too much time on these days, but it is something that in my younger days, I was always fascinated by space and the nature of space and also the nature of time, I guess, too, which I'd like to talk to you about because you mentioned that a while ago when you were talking about your worldview. What do you think?
Before we move on, the one thing I would say about space is we tend to focus upon the insignificance of the human because space is so darn big. The universe is so massive, and pale blue dot, as Carl Sagan would have said, in relation to what the Earth is. But the one thing that sort of counterbalances that for me is we're using size as our measure of significance when really we might want to use complexity because the one thing that is the greatest marvel in the whole universe, as far as I'm concerned, is the human brain. For the simple reason is we have never seen anything more complex than the human brain. So while we might get really, really excited about, photographs from the Hubble Space Telescope of distant nebulae and everything, it's all very simple out there. It's massive, but it's simple. And then we have the human brain. So I think even though we're so tiny, we're really, really significant.
I would agree with that. I have always, always, always loved learning about the human brain because it is so complex. And it, to me, is the biggest mystery in all of whatever you would call this, life or history or the nature of reality. I mean, how do you, like, whatever lens you want to look at the world through, whatever belief system you want to subscribe to, that's cool. But the thing is that the biggest mystery to me has always been what's inside of you. And it starts with the brain. It starts with like the way that it works with your guts, and how it all sort of syncs up holistically. And I spent a long time, the last several years of my life, sort of studying, the brain gut connection and, just some of these more interesting biological or physiological things. But yeah, so I'm right there with you in terms of the brain. We don't explore the inner space inside of us nearly as much as we should. And I'm not even talking about like spiritually. I'm just talking about biologically here. But, and that's a good point too about it's very simple out there, at least from what we see of it. And we don't do nearly as much exploring too about what's on Earth with us right now. Like we still don't know much about the oceans. We don't really explore that. Like maybe there's something that we can learn about ourselves by doing that. I like this. There's this theory that consciousness emerged from the sea. I kind of like that. I don't know why. It just resonates with me. But you mentioned something a few minutes ago that I wanted to. And it wasn't the time, but it was something else that I wanted to talk about, but I forget. So if it comes back to me, I will interject it. But let's go. Let's talk about time a little bit. Time has always fascinated me. I grew up, reading science fiction stories about time travel, and that to me my idea of time and time travel has obviously morphed throughout the years. But what is the nature of time to you? I mean, obviously on some level it's a man-made, construct to sort of maybe, control us on some level. But what do you see time as? Is it like space? Is it a plane of some sort that you can access?
Yeah, this is a subject that I really like. I've given considerable thought to this. It's a particularly good subject because essentially every question that you could possibly ask about purpose and meaning is essentially a question about time. So I think we tend to have this natural intuition, which typically is a wrong one. Just like, we've wrong natural intuitions about everything. Like if we didn't know anything, if we lived a few millennia ago, we would assume the world is flat purely because it's what you see, but it's not, as we know. Well, of course, there's some who disagree with that these days, but, time, we have a natural intuition about time that sees it as a kind of film strip that's constantly recording. So it has dimension. That's the way we think of it. And we think of it that way because the brain functions as a recording device. You can cast your mind back to any memories that you have. You can also think ahead to things that may or may not happen in your future. So it's as if time is stretched out like an actual dimension. And we think of the present as this little slice of time that's constantly moving forward. So that's a wrong intuition, because you can strip it right down and just use a little Occam's razor approach of just going with, the one view that makes the least assumptions. So can we actually have a view of reality where there is no such thing as time? And I think we can. And I think it works best when we think of it that way, because just to do a little bit of sort of a playful experiment here, I can say it's the present moment. Now I can go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and I can say again, it's the present moment. So you might think, well, it's not the same present moment, but it is. It's always the present. Now. It's always the present moment. So even when you consult memories, you're doing it in the present moment. The memories are stored in the present moment because they're in your brain. They're accessed here. And when you think of yourself in those memories, you're remembering a person who experienced something as the present when he experienced it. And you know, when you look ahead in time, in so-called time, to something you're planning to do next week, and you can picture yourself in your head doing it, but you know that when you're going to do it, you're going to experience it as the present. So I don't think time has actual dimension. I think it's just always now. And we can take this really far. We know that the universe is 13.7 billion years old because of the cosmic microwave background radiation that we can observe. So that's like saying, you can evoke this massive past out of the universe as if that's somehow recorded somewhere, but it's not recorded anywhere. It's just that the cosmic microwave background radiation gives us a kind of present day echo of the previous shape of the present moment 13.7 billion years ago. So relativity is a tough nut to crack if you want to erase time as a variable, but it can be done. It's tricky to wrap your head around it. And this idea of there being no time, there's just always the present moment, but the present moment is always moving and changing. It makes you feel very grounded in the present. And it's a good counterbalance against the sort of pathology that humans have, where they're always regretting the past or anticipating the future, and their head is never in the one moment where life actually happens, which is the now, the present. So that's kind of, loosely speaking, that's my view on time.
Well, what's your view on death? That's a subject that we tackled in the last episode on the show here. And I'm curious, how that experience, because obviously when you look at like near-death experiences and all this conjecture about, the afterlife and whatnot, I mean, you can come to certain conclusions based on other people's experiences, but where would you say that you come from these days on what death is and what that means for us?
I can't say for certain that there's no afterlife, but I don't believe in it because I've kind of got to the point where I don't need to believe in it. People subscribe to views of the afterlife because they're attached to their own ego and they want the ego to survive death. But when you really come to terms with the view that the ego is a fiction, that there's no actual self inside the body, it allows you to be more playful with life, to hold it lightly, to understand that your life is temporary, but to understand that in a way that's really not depressing at all. You lose any sense that you really need an afterlife. So on those grounds, I don't really believe in it. I know there's an abundance of near-death experiences, but I really don't know what to make of those. There doesn't seem to be a huge amount of consistency with what's reported. Interestingly, there was a Christian gave me a book to read about a year ago on near-death experiences, but the whole thing was designed to support the view that people go to heaven or hell, which it wasn't very convincing. So it's hard to know what to make of near-death experiences. But in terms of death, people have this idea that if it ends, it robs your life of meaning. This idea that the thing has to keep going if it has meaning, and death robs life of meaning. It really doesn't. If you could really imagine yourself still living in an afterlife 40 trillion years from now in the future, and you cast your mind back on your little human experience of 70 odd years, what are those 70 years compared to the trillion years that you've had since then? And that's where I realized that the whole idea of extending your identity in time indefinitely, becomes a bit pointless, because we go through life and we forget as much as we remember. We forget a lot more than we remember. I've got so few memories left now of when I was, pre 7 years old. There's just a few fragments of memory left. So essentially the person I was when I was a child is dead and gone. And something else is here now, this 46-year-old who is not the child. So if I survive another 30 years, it won't be the 46-year-old that's there. It'll be something else who will have forgotten most of what it was like when I was 46. So you see, there's this progression of forgetting as we make new experiences through life. And then the problem with death is that it's a very sudden end. It's a very sudden forgetting. And that's what makes it traumatic more for the people left behind who love you, not so much for you because you're gone. But I'm really comfortable with the idea that I will not be here one day. And it doesn't rob my life of meaning, because things are meaningful for the time in which they happen. They're not meaningful in some kind of forever sense. This idea that you have to somehow take your life story and nail it to the pillars of eternity for it to have some kind of significance, that's just crazy. And yet Christians are fiercely attached to their identity in this way, this idea that they're going to go to glory one day and that their lives matter. They only matter in a very playful, transient sense. And I think that's the healthiest outlook to have on it.
Do you practice any sort of magic yourself, or do you subscribe, I guess, to the more occult worldview now?
No, not really. I commit the error really of reading more than I actually do. So I've got plenty of theory in my head about it all, but very little practice. And really, the problem with that comes from, I've read about how curses are performed, but do I want to curse anybody? No, because I'm a normal human being who has compassion, But yeah, I do talk about magic in sort of the last quarter of the book, but it is highly theoretical. For me, the only real interest I have in magic is in how much it actually supports non-duality. People like Anton LaVey, he died in near poverty, essentially. So you would have to ask how much of a magician really was he if he wasn't able to use that to bring material success for himself in the final quarter of his life, So I don't think magic or psychic things are really very useful for much. I know there's that book, what's it called? The Secret by Rhonda Byrne. I haven't read the book, but I watched the DVD once, and I just thought it was just so totally over the top. I'm sure you've probably heard of it, this law of attraction thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So I think there's some truth to the law of attraction, because it's essentially this idea that you use your state of mind in order to bring certain things to bear in your life. But through exaggeration, that book and that DVD just ruins everything, because it's just not that simple. Magic works with the existing flow of life. It's not some kind of thing that you can use to have an ace up your sleeve to make $1 million or something like that, or to get a superstar girlfriend or something. It just doesn't work like that. It's subtle. Same with the experiments in telekinesis. They work with conservation of energy laws. I can't just make something levitate off the desk, because where am I going to get the energy to do that? Where's it going to come from? So it appears to be that the energy comes from the body. So it's only very subtle things. And I was never able to move a matchstick, much as I tried, even though I witnessed my friend doing it. I really only got as far as moving a side wheel under a glass bowl, and even then it would only happen some of the time. And I guess this is part of the reason why psychic things and magical things have never really entered science proper, because they're just too slippery for lab confirmation. You could have an experience where, let's say, you get a sudden feeling of dread that comes over you, that something terrible has happened to a loved one. And then 10 minutes later, you get a phone call to say they've been in a road traffic accident. People report things like this, but you can't then say to that person who had that experience, okay, we're going to go to the lab and you're going to repeat this for me. It just doesn't work that way, because they didn't know what they did to make that happen. And yet people have strange experiences. But like I say, I think it's a misuse of power, or it's a misuse of responsibility, and it's probably worthless anyway to try and use the occult to benefit your life in some kind of dramatic way. It's not really useful for that. Yeah.
Well, I think that, that might enter some interesting territory in terms of, the nature of magic. And I've been thinking recently about the ideas of high and low magic and what that means. And like you mentioned,
is that like greater and lesser magic?
Yeah, you could probably call it that too. But like you mentioned, LaVey dying in poverty, and he's one of many examples of people who you would call magicians throughout the years or throughout the centuries that died in poverty, that died with like nothing to their name. And I think you have to
Aleister Crowley, and he was a deadbeat dad as well.
Sure, yeah. John Dee as well. This guy who's credited with a lot of, sort of just these great magical inventions, for lack of better terms. But he worked for the Queen of England, but he dies in like poverty and like relative obscurity on some level, and his legacy is forgotten, for all these centuries. So I think you have to look at, though, the ideas of greater or lesser magic, or high or low magic. And if that low magic is not what we're talking about, like maybe these guys were not using magic for material gain. Maybe they weren't really trying to live a life on that level. Like maybe they just didn't care so much about acquiring wealth or a better, sort of material existence, which, is probably important to a lot of people. And why it would not be important to them, I don't know. But maybe also they were practicing magic on a higher level, and it wasn't about that for them. Like you look at Dee's work and you look at LaVey's work, and you see like the art of it all, sort of coming into focus the more that you study it. And it really is, to me, about like, maybe it's more about them creating something out of nothing, which you would call artistic on some level, and then having a large group of people then interact with it and also, gain something from it. Because that, to me, is the power of magic, which is the power of art as well. It's a power of creativity in general. So I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, but that's kind of what I've been toying around with, this idea of like a higher, more artistic form of magic that's not really self-serving, that's like really meant to impact the people who interact with it afterwards, as opposed to like a lower form of magic where you are using it for, sort of like money spells and love spells and those sorts of like things, and then it's impacting other people against their will and sort of like unknowingly, like they're interacting with your spell not knowing it. Whereas that higher form of magic is, like you write a book and people interact with that and they take lessons from that and you make a positive impact on them. And that, to me, is the highest form of magic, when people knowingly interact with your spell, so to speak, and can use it to better their own lives.
Yeah, I get it. I resonate with what you're saying there. Again, I guess for me, it comes down to what's your view of ego? If you're interested in magic, but you've got a really big ego, then you're going to use it for selfish means. But if you've got past that whole idea of ego, if you've got to grips with a philosophy like non-duality, where you essentially are very comfortable with the idea that you're not going to be here one day, which kind of makes you think, well, what's the point in accumulating wealth? and you kind of understand that there isn't a self that needs to be saved or really that needs to build itself. Well, then, yeah, magic becomes something else. Then it becomes something that you can do selflessly for others. But even beyond that, I think there's just a real excitement about. I mean, I could put it this way: I'm in touch with a side of reality here that even the great Stephen Hawking knows nothing about, right? So now I'm not comparing myself to Stephen Hawking in terms of physics. He was a brilliant physicist. I'm not even a physicist. So I'm not fit to tie the guy's shoelaces in his field, right? But the fact that I have had a paranormal experience, that is incredibly valuable to me because it shows to me that there is a side of reality that is being almost universally ignored by the scientific community. So the great overarching quest of Hawking's life was the theory of everything, find the theory of everything. And I'm looking at that and I'm thinking, yeah, but there's this side of life that you don't even know is there, but it really is. And unfortunately, it's actually finding this and stumbling across it is so hard because there's all these charlatans everywhere. But it's real. And to have that awareness that consciousness really matters, and consciousness, it isn't just this lump of clay in the head. It's spread out more than that. Whatever abstract philosophy we put on it, you are more than just a thing sitting in the head. Because if that's all you are, then telekinesis and subtle forms of ESP, like that feeling of dread I talked about, those things can't happen in a world that's just purely materialistic. But they do happen. So that just fills me with so much excitement to just know that you're in a minority of people who've had an experience that many scientifically inclined people would laugh at, yet you know it's real, and it informs you about reality. So that's really the value of magic and parapsychology for me.
So I want to wrap up here, Darryl, with one question for you, and I'm gonna quote something you wrote in the book, and then I'll pose a question about it. But you said that the most productive mentality you can have is simply this: always, always, always have a worldview that doesn't resist change. Go wherever the information leads you without fear, because surely the truth is never something to dread. End quote. So, would you say, I mean, obviously you came from the Christian worldview, which you outlined at the beginning of the chat, and now you seem to be more into the, occult worldview on some level. Like you said, maybe you don't practice it as much, but you do sort of, I guess, have an intellectual curiosity about it, which I do as well. But it seems to me that there are a lot of people that have these beliefs as well that don't really entertain other worldviews. That they too, on some level, seem to resist this change as much as anybody else from any other worldview. And obviously, we can't speak for anyone but ourselves here. But I'm wondering, just from your perspective, do you consider your current worldview to be one that is open to change?
Yes, always. I actually wrote a book back in 2009, which I called Reality Check. So that's just 1 year into my journey into this stuff. And I released it. And within the next year or two, I had started making all these changes to the text and even stripping off chapters and writing new chapters. And I realized that I had written the book too early. So things kept changing and changing. And the book now, which is called iUniverse, it's actually a big evolution of that original small book, Reality Check, into something far grander than it was before. There was a big delay at the publishing end. It was meant to come out a few years ago. It's only out now. But in the intervening time, I made changes again to the text, expanding chapters, refining my arguments. So I'm always in a process of change. I wouldn't say there's been too many dramatic changes in my worldview since 2008, but there have been some. And I'm always on the lookout for where I might have got it wrong, because it would be a miracle if I got everything right. So it's unfortunate that when you commit something to print, you can't change it again like the way you can if it's purely an ebook. You can just make changes, but that's the nature of how this works. I'm sure in 5 years' time, there'll be a few bits and pieces in my book that I'll be kind of wincing at, going, well, that wasn't quite right. I wish I'd said it a different way. But that's just the way things go. Not even Einstein was right about everything.
Yeah, and you touched on my beef with ebooks in general there, how they can be modified at someone's whim and will. So that's a whole other conversation, though. However, before we go, tell people where they can find your book, iUniverse, if they're interested in learning more about you and your worldview.
Yeah, iUniverse is available in all the usual places like Amazon worldwide, Barnes and Noble, Waterstones in the UK. Ground zero for information about it is my personal website, which is www.darrylsloan.com. That's DARRYLSLOAN.com.
Awesome. Well, Darryl, I appreciate you taking some time here to chat with me. Look forward to speaking to you again sometime soon, maybe.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you.